I want to say a few words today by way of introduction to this particular book. I want to talk to you for a few minutes about the book, about why I wrote it, what it's about, what I hope that it might achieve as a book, and then I actually want to take this opportunity to also read a few excerpts from the book to give you a sense of how it's written, where it travels, what it tries to do. And the first thing I ought to emphasize is that I myself am a migrant to anthropology, a bit of a newcomer to anthropology in the sense that I didn't take a single anthropology class when I was an undergraduate at Amherst College. I went to graduate school to actually study environmental studies. I didn't actually even go to graduate school at UC Berkeley to study anthropology. I went because I was an environmentalist. And as an environmentalist in my teens and 20s, I was really wrestling with what you might say is the problem of human nature, these concerns around the environment and ecology that already seemed so acute some 20, 25 years ago, and the question of how we might arrive at more effective ways of engaging with these environmental crises. And the thing that I felt again and again as an environmental activist is that I kept running up against certain assumptions about human nature. And in particular, certain assumptions about the enduring and stubborn nature of what it is that makes people tick, of why they do the things they do, of why it is that people are stuck with the habits, tendencies, and inclinations that they have. And it was a sense of frustration with those assumptions, with those more restrictive pictures of human nature and human possibility that actually wound up in anthropology as a discipline that seeks to give, I would argue, and as many of us know, a more expansive picture of human possibility. Now, this is, of course, a curious time to be thinking of that expansive horizon of human possibility in affirmative terms. We live now in an era that many people know more and more by the name of the Anthropocene, that is to say, as a global era of human geological dominion. The expansive horizons of human possibility seem to have landed us in impasses that threaten life on Earth to a great extent, whether human lives or non-human lives, and especially those who are placed more precariously on this planet that all of us share. So this is, of course, a strange time to be celebrating anything with regard to human possibility, when human possibility seems to have landed us in certain impasses that we need to learn how to wrestle with. It's also, I would say, a peculiar time to be celebrating anthropology, or even affirming or embracing anthropology as a way of wrestling with such matters, precisely because for those of us, especially who are here in the United States, we find almost as though the rug is being pulled out from under our feet with regard to the working conditions that many anthropologists face, with regard to the very possibility or even the impossibility of making a livelihood as a working anthropologist. It becomes rather difficult to imagine oneself making a living as an anthropologist, given the job conditions that many people, younger folks in the field, face especially. And so this, again, I think is another reason why one might tend perhaps to be a bit skeptical about what it is that anthropology can do, or what anthropologists can do. There's, of course, another layer to that, which is a deeper layer, a more historical layer, that has to do with the longstanding and absolutely true complicity of this particular field with longstanding patterns, longstanding structures of exploitation and, in fact, oppression that have to do with anthropology's birth in the colonial crucible, that is to say, the emergence of anthropology as a field of knowledge that arose in the interior recesses of European colonial domination, so much of the world. Legacies that remain with us today in many ways in which authority, authoritative knowledge, lines between acceptable and unacceptable forms of discourse, all these hierarchies that we continue to live with, one might argue, carry still the imprint of those colonial relations out of which this field grew. So these are all reasons, I think, to be a bit skeptical about anthropology, to be a bit uncertain as to what it is that one could actually do with the field, with learning in the field, with the lessons of the field. And yet, at the same time, one might also make the argument that the world that we live in is a world that needs anthropologists. It's a world that needs anthropological insight, whether we're wrestling with the conundrums of climate change and other contemporary forms of ecological crisis, whether we're wrestling with the condition of migrants and refugees and the conditions under which they seek refuge in countries like ours, sometimes to no avail. Whether we're wrestling with a host of other contemporary problems, it is certainly the case that anthropologists and anthropological methods have a great deal to contribute to our understanding of these problems and our potential understanding or potential uh, suggestion of possible ways around these particular impasses. So the book, in a sense, begins with that particular paradoxical time for anthropology, the sense that at the very time that one might make the case that we see the need for anthropological insight and analysis, we find that the conditions of our work and the implications of our work seem in some ways more fraught than ever. Now, what I seek to do in the face of that particular paradox is to make a certain kind of argument. And the argument that I make is that one way to begin to unravel that paradox is to consider the possibility that what we wrestle with regard to the human in anthropology, is not simply human beings that exist in particular times and places as determinate societies or cultures, not even the human as the name for a particular species, that is to say our species, but instead humanity as a horizon of aspiration. The argument that I seek to make in this book is that what is at stake in anthropological inquiry is an engagement with a humanity yet to come. That is to say, anthropology might be understood not simply as an effort to document the cultures that comprise the human in particular places, but actually an effort in more affirmative terms to culture or cultivate a more expansive sense of humanity, a more expansive way of engaging with the world and with each other in human terms, possibly non-human terms, as a horizon of aspiration. That's one thing I try to show in this book, that we might actually conceive of anthropology as engaged in the effort to help open our contemporary world to a humanity yet to come. Now, I'm just going to take a moment to, to put this up. And I was wrestling with, this is the medium that's new to me. I don't do Zoom meetings or webinars very often. This is the first one, in fact, a webinar as such that I've ever held. And I was trying to figure out what to do with images. And Zoom has this way of allowing for the sharing of the screen as a way of sharing the images that you have on that screen, but it produces all these other problems that I wasn't really happy with. And so I actually decided what I would do is to print out a few things, images from the book, in fact, to talk with and to talk around, and to do that in a pretty DIY fashion, that is, in fact, a clothespin. And this simple gesture itself, I would argue, attests to something that, to me, is essential to the way in which we work as anthropologists, and is in fact one of the essential points that I make in this book, which is that we have a way, a very good way, a very interesting way of engaging improvisationally with circumstance, with the materials that we have at hand, and that a lot of what is interesting that arises from anthropological inquiry and anthropological engagement with the world arises from that improvisational spirit of encounter. So take my use of the clothespin and the little printouts as an example of that kind. This image is from the border wall between Tijuana, Mexico, and San Diego County in Southern California. This was a message that someone had written a couple years back that I encountered in the midst of fieldwork in that area. A couple years ago, someone had simply just said, for more humanity in the world. This sense that the world is a place that needs more humanity is something I think that a lot of us feel. I actually think that anthropology is a discipline well suited to work with that expectation or that desire. So very quickly, the book is a small book. It's a book most especially of 3 essays that seek to put forward the possibility that anthropology has methods with which to engage with the uneasiness of our time. And the way that I try to set it up is as follows. What I seek to do with this particular project is not simply to make sense of anthropology as a field, but to do so as an ethnographer. This book is an ethnography of anthropologists at work. It's an attempt to wrestle with the promise of anthropology through the eyes of an ethnographer. That is to say, I don't write here as an expert. I don't write here as someone who is going to put forward for you authoritative knowledge of another kind with regard to how we ought to understand this field. Instead, what I try to suggest is that if one approaches the field through the eyes of an apprentice, through the eyes of an attentive observer, we might find ways of approaching the field, its insights and its possibilities that we might not otherwise see. The first essay engages with the empirical world, the empirical reality that we encounter and wrestle with as anthropologists. And I try to make the argument that that empirical world is more interesting than we give it credit for, that in fact, through the pursuit of anthropological methods, we find ways of thinking between the here and now and those virtual horizons of possibility that we might understand to arise out of the givenness of the world. And I try to show how that's possible in that first chapter by thinking historically and in between the work of Zora Neale Hurston and Branislav. The effort is to try to think between their lives and the work that they produced. That is to say, relying on letters and other insights into the biographical texture of their lives to give not only a sense of how they worked as anthropologists in the early 20th century, but also the world, the empirical world that their work gives us access to. The second chapter turns to what I put forward as a method of experience. The argument that I make in that second chapter is that we have ways of engaging the world at hand. We have ways of wrestling with that open-endedness of the world that we encounter through a method that paradoxically is deeply invested in the unknown and the unpredictable. That is to say, the problem of method has long been a kind of curious one in anthropology. How do you teach people to engage with that which you can't anticipate? How do you inculcate this idea of somehow giving an effective or a compelling account of that which by its very nature is somehow deeply unpredictable or fundamentally ineffable? And the argument that I try to make in this second chapter is that there's actually a kind of method to that madness, that there's a way in which we learn to engage the unknown and its potential as anthropologists that we know, of course, from fieldwork, but which continues as well through other horizons of anthropological experience. So the most essential argument that I make in this second chapter is that a method of experience, that is to say, a way of encountering and living with and somehow relaying the charge of the unknown as we encounter it in fieldwork, continues in the experience of other domains of anthropological life and expression. And what I try to show is that there are, in fact, continuities between the experience of fieldwork, of reading, of writing, and of teaching. So whether we look at what it is that anthropologists do in the classroom, how it is that anthropologists encounter texts, or indeed how it is that anthropologists write texts, what runs through all of these different domains is a commitment to the unknown and an interest in carrying forward its charge to others, to readers, to students, to those who encounter the kind of work that we do. That's the essential argument of the second chapter. And I turn from there in the third chapter to a closer engagement with this horizon of humanity, or this notion of a humanity yet to come. And what I'm seeking to do here is to think between the human and the non-human in particular. That is to say, to try to confront recent debates about the relationship between the human and the non-human and how we might approach that as anthropologists, and to make the argument that with regard to these debates and concerns, we have certain resources in anthropology that we haven't yet paid sufficient heed. And in particular, what I seek to do here is to excavate and carry forward what we might understand as a Herderian legacy of thinking about nature and culture in anthropology. That is to say, a way of thinking through the interweaving of nature and culture that's indebted to the work of the German Romantic, 19th century thinker, Johann Gottfried von Herder, as a set of conceptual resources with which we might make sense of how it is that humanity remains in anthropology an arena of culture and cultivation. And I try to show in a practical way, that is to say, again, in a more empirical fashion, how it is that that more open-ended horizon of human aspiration manifests itself through various concrete possibilities. That is to say, through the articulation of anthropological insight and imagination in a few empirical instances. I look at the ways in which indigenous activists make sense of anthropological categories in the context of global conservation politics to try to open up that politics, to crack it open and bend it in different ways. I look at how a pair of contemporary artists imagine themselves as anthropologists as a way of casting a critical light on our contemporary obsessions with plastic. And I look at how it is that a novelist, a speculative novelist like Ursula Le Guin, tapped into her own experience with anthropology as the daughter of Alfred Kroeber and Theodora Kroeber, and mobilized that anthropological imagination as a way of building those worlds that are so compelling in her fictive work. And again, to try to show how it is that we can arrive at some understanding of the ways in which anthropological thinking and imagination are essential to the kind of critical work that's done in these three particular arenas, whether it's politics, art, or fiction. In all of those cases, as I said earlier, the effort is really to kind of think with anthropologists as they work, to think with the texture of anthropology as it unfolds in the world, and to do so in a manner that is as experiential, again, as possible. The book is short, it's 120 pages long. I'd like to think it's readable, I'd like to think it's teachable. The idea is to give a sense of the kind of things that I've been talking about happening as they happen through the texture of the book and its narratives themselves. So what I'm going to do now is to read you just 3 short excerpts from the book as a way of giving you a more concrete sense of the argumentation and the writing and the stories through which these arguments unfold. So what I'm going to do first is to read from that first chapter, which is called The World at Hand, and it's an attempt to think through the problem of empiricism in anthropology. And the argument that I make here, in a nutshell, is that that empirical world that's at stake for us as anthropologists is a world that we can't make sense of except through a kind of critical embrace of magic, myth, and metaphor. And I try to do that by thinking between two figures that we might not think in relation to each other very often, but I think actually make for very interesting and important juxtaposition. That is to say, as I mentioned earlier, Branislav Malinowski and Zora Neale Hurston. Okay. Branislav Malinowski and Zora Neale Hurston, an unlikely pair to be sure. A scientist and a novelist, a paragon of rationalism and an artist of fictions, one a founding father of anthropology and the other an illegitimate daughter, in a sense, of course, but still a very real sense, of another foundational paterfamilias. The tension between these poles runs to the heart of anthropology and its peculiar ways of knowing the world. But there are also certain intriguing resonances between the thinking of these two figures, Malinowski and Hurston. Take, for example, their shared passion for writing, or even the shape of the world itself, the reality that found expression in their texts. Haiti, Hurston tells us in her controversial 1938 book, Tell My Horse, is a land populated by countless voodoo gods and goddesses. Among them is one she names Erzuli Frida, described by Hurston as the pagan goddess of love. She writes of Erzuli as a jealous and possessive spirit, demanding a total devotion from the many mortal men she chooses as her husbands. How does a man know that he's been selected by the goddess as a consort? It usually begins in troubled dreams, Hurston writes. At first, his dreams are vague. He is visited by a strange being which he cannot identify. He cannot make out at first what is wanted of him. He touches rich fabrics momentarily, but they flit away from his grasp. The anthropologist is seeking here to put into words a reality equally elusive, for there's nothing figurative about the intended union. Despite the garb of the Virgin Mary in which she is often pictured, what Erzuli pursues is ecstatic sexual contact with her devotees. In one of the book's most moving passages, Hurston intimates that she too has glimpsed something of this impossible coupling. There's a whole library of tales, she writes, of how this man and that were réclamés by the goddess Erzuli, or how that one came to attach himself to the cult. I have stood in one of the bedrooms, decorated and furnished for a visit from the invisible perfection. I looked at the little government employee standing there amid the cut flowers, the cakes, the perfumes, and the lace-covered bed, and with the spur of imagination, saw his common clay glow with some borrowed light, and his earthiness transfigured as he mated with a goddess that night, with Erzuli, the lady upon the rock whose toes are pretty and flowery. Hurston's writings, Henry Louis Gates has suggested, are steeped in a mythic realism, lush and dense within a lyrical Black idiom. Passages such as this one from Tell My Horse make for vivid and engaging reading. In fact, I want to just share with you this image of Hurston doing some of her fieldwork in the American South. But do such moments of dream and reverie, moments in which the anthropologist herself succumbs to an imaginative drift, signal a rupture of scholarly authority? Empirical rigor in anthropology is often conceived as a fidelity to the evidence of the senses, the here and now of worldly encounters. What Hurston gives us here, however, is an unsteady interplay of presence and absence, a gesture toward what remains invisible, yet is somehow still present and palpable still. We are led to glimpse, in Vincent Crapanzano's words, horizons that extend from the insistent reality of the here and now into that optative space or time, the space-time of the imaginary. What would it mean to be faithful to these images of another reality beyond the givenness of the here and now? What kind of empiricism could accommodate the presence, perhaps even the truth, of such spiritual beings and intangible forces? For what was at stake in the stories, myths, and visions that she related, Hurston insisted, was life as we actually live it. Malinowski, too, was brought to the significance of myth by attending to the lived reality of the Trobriand Islanders. Take, for example, this passage from Argonauts of the Western Pacific, recounting the experience of coral atolls and lagoons for those who found each place to echo an event in the mythic past. We must try to reconstruct, he wrote, the influence of myth upon this vast landscape as it colors, gives it meaning, and transforms it into something live and familiar. What was a mere rock now becomes a personality. What was a speck on the horizon becomes a beacon, hallowed by romantic associations with heroes. A meaningless configuration of landscape acquires a significance, obscure no doubt, but full of intense emotion. Sailing with the natives, especially with novices to the Kula, I often observed how deep was their interest in sections of landscape impregnated with legendary meaning, how the elder ones would point and explain, the younger ones would gaze and wonder, while the talk was full of mythological names. Such moments of wonder, Malinowski would later emphasize in Myth and Primitive Psychology, attested to the living reality of myth, the way its tales and legends made possible the narrative resurrection of a primeval reality otherwise lost to consciousness and experience. Myths could provoke unexpected ways of perceiving and interacting with the world at hand. Far from an aimless outpouring of vain imaginings, Malinowski urged, myths were best understood as an active force in the myriad engagements of practical life. So be it with regard to the native mind and its primitive psychology. But what about those for whom these arguments were made so carefully? Myth and magic had a crucial role to play wherever the elements of chance and accident have a wide and extensive range, Malinowski wrote. But he also observed at the same time that the knowledge of a European field worker in such milieus depended on his own ability to keep his powers of observation and his sense of reality under control. This contrast between the credulous beliefs of others and the knowledge of those among us who have a more secure hold on reality is of course a familiar one. And yet, this well-known line is confounded once again by the way that Malinowski's fieldwork seems actually to have unfolded. For what we find in his diaries and letters is an anthropologist constantly wrestling with visions, with unreal forms and phantom figures that disrupt whatever discipline and focus he can muster. Here are a few excerpts from his field notes. I felt too rotten to look and was bogged down in the trashy novel. Even in the fjord, when the sea was calmer, I could not manage to come back to reality. At moments, the pink silhouettes of the mountains appear through the mist like phantoms of reality in the flood of blue, like the unfinished ideas of some youthful creative force. At night, a little tired but not exhausted, I sang to a Wagner melody the words "kiss my ass" to chase away sorcerers. I tried to separate from my companions, but they were apparently nervous and the road was bad too. ERM's letters are considerably more subjective. I'm transported entirely in a trance, drunk, the Negroes don't exist, I don't even want to eat or drink. I tore my eyes from the book and I could hardly believe that here I was among Neolithic savages and that I was sitting here peacefully while terrible things were going on back there in Europe. Such moments of drift and distraction, occasioned by the novels, letters, dreams, and figures that would come his way, do not have the consistency of a mythic corpus. And yet these instances suggest that the texture of the world as encountered by this fieldworker, the foreign reality given presence in his texts, is one shot through with invisible forces and ghostly presences, a here and now populated by the traces and remnants of many elsewheres. So that's just one small excerpt in which, one small example of the way in which I try to show how a certain kind of creative thinking between these two figures, who would seem to be antagonistic poles vis-a-vis each other, Malinowski and Hurston, actually enables a different way of returning not only to the history of anthropology, but to this very question of that empirical reality, that empirical world that we seek to wrestle with as anthropologists, and the possibility that the only way to confront it effectively is in some ways to sort of capitulate to its own tendency to spill beyond the givenness of the here and now. So that's a small excerpt from the first of these three chapters. And what I want to do for just a few more minutes is to give you two other small glimpses of the book. I'm going to take you now to the second chapter, which is called A Method of Experience, Reading, Writing, Teaching, and Fieldwork, in which I try to make the argument, as I said earlier, that there's a sort of continuity in our encounter with, engagement with, even capitulation to the force of the unknown that runs through different domains of anthropological expression: fieldwork, reading, writing, and teaching. This was in some ways the most exciting chapter to work on. I had the chance to trail along with anthropologists. They were doing things that we don't often have the chance to observe ourselves. I got to hang out with my colleague Jane Geyer in her classroom for a semester, trying to make sense of how it is that she works as a teacher of anthropology. Got to spend a few days with Michael Jackson at the Harvard Divinity School, trying to get an ethnographic sense of how he thinks and works, in fact, how he writes as a writer. I got to visit Claude Lévi-Strauss's library, his study in France, and have a series of conversations with his widow that helped me reconstruct the process of reading as he experienced it, his reading of the mythologies of the Amerindian world, and how that experience gained form in his text. And ultimately, I also had the chance to spend a few days with the anthropologist and scholar of science, Natasha Meyers, getting a sense of how she's been working more recently in High Park in Toronto as an ethnographer of an urban park milieu, and in particular, its plant life. So what I want to do for you now is to read a short excerpt from this second chapter that involves me in the company of Natasha, as well as in the company of the trees and other living beings that she works with. This is a photograph of hers, by the way, one among a series of very stunning images that she's been producing that try to convey in a very tangible, tactile sense the life of these other beings that one might find oneself in the company of when one does the kind of ethnographic work that she's been doing. I place my hand against the bark of the towering oak, trying to absorb something of the times it has seen. The lichens nestled into its crevices, the mark left by the foot of a stretching runner, the fumes from passing cars at this gateway into Toronto's Hyde Park. It's never easy to prepare for fieldwork, which always seems to involve unforeseen challenges. Think of the vague and laconic advice that Evans Pritchard famously dispensed. Bring a stool with you, and don't get food on your field notes, and get interested in whatever interests the natives. Figuring out what interests this particular native proves especially difficult, given its stolid arboreal presence. The woman beside me lays her face on the trunk, wraps its breadth in a warm embrace. I try to imagine, like her, what it must be like for the oak to inhabit this urban space, the strain of ripening acorns in the early summer, of living with this traffic and bustle. My companion is Natasha Meyers, an anthropologist at York, one of Canada's largest public universities. Her first book, Rendering Life Molecular, has just won the Robert K. Merton Award from the American Sociological Association. The book describes the kinesthetic techniques and affective entanglements that enable lab scientists to model the crystallographic structures of proteins. Meyers is now steeped in experience of a different kind, that of the oak savanna that took root here after the last ice age, in her words, a 10,000-year-old happening. Trained first as a biologist and then in science studies, she approaches these plants as inquirers in their own right, as sentient beings feeling out of place through their physical form and chemical expression. She relies on methods of what Goethe called exact sensorial imagination to intuit what these dauntingly foreign beings are doing with their limbs and leaves. And all of this is unfolding in a 398-acre wooded park just down the street from where Meyers lives in Toronto, a park close to where she grew up, a park where she sometimes ran and hid as a child. I can't ever leave here, she tells me. This work might take 100 years. Natasha has already been absorbed in this woodland's doings for many days over many months when I pay her a visit in July 2016. To follow her through High Park is to traverse a field of minor yet continuous events, a space of flaking wood once held by a log, the potent scent of a decaying bergamot flower, the blackened ooze leaking from the base of an oak, a pile of berry seeds heaped onto a winding branch. Unlike the lab environments she examined for her first book, this is a space shared with walkers, lovers, birders, mushroom collectors, soccer players, and countless other human enthusiasts. Some of the trails we walk along, Natasha tells me, date back to the many centuries of intensive use by First Nations peoples who shaped this landscape as an open savanna. Artifacts of that time can still be found here and there along the trails, and these histories of human occupation are essential to the story that she's crafting. There's also, though, a problem beyond the human domain that motivates her studies. The space itself throws open questions. The space has stories it wants heard. My job is to become responsive enough, attentive enough to sense or perceive them. Bird calls filter through the trees while we walk, as do occasional police sirens. We can't help but think about the reports that come each morning this week from the Republican National Convention in Cleveland, the politics of Black Lives Matter, and the fallout from an attempted military coup in Turkey. Natasha hopes to find a way of speaking to such urgent concerns from the everyday evidence of life and death, growth and decay in this urban ecological assemblage, a neo-colonial landscape itself imperiled by modern regimes of management. Her attentions have been focused most closely on a 2-acre area on the eastern edge of the park, a small space where she can recognize, remarkably, almost every individual plant we pass. For months now, she's been guiding multi-sensory tours through this area, inviting local residents to observe, sketch, hear, and imagine the living conditions of its vegetal life. Over a few days, I try out some of these exercises with Natasha, which she conceives as collaborative research protocols. She tells me to bend my nose to a goldenrod flower, asking what images it evokes. Struggling to put the elusive scent into words, I tell her it smells rich and sweet, like cold butter. Nearby, she has a pad and pencil in hand as she takes in the smell of a flowering Queen Anne's lace, drawing a sinuous line across the paper as a gestural diagram of its olfactory bouquet. So once again, this is just a small excerpt from a larger section of writing in this particular chapter, but I hope it gives you a sense of how it is that I seek in this chapter and in the rest of the book to trail along with other anthropologists as an ethnographer in their midst, trying to make sense of the emerging, unfolding rationality of a practice as it in fact does emerge and unfold in a larger world, whether that's a world populated by human beings that we attend to or other non-human living beings of the kind that Natasha has been spending so much of her time and attention with over the last few years. And what I'm going to do then with that is to give you one small glimpse now of the third chapter in this book, where I turn, as I suggested earlier, to this notion of a humanity to come, and to try to make the case that if we look at our field back from a certain set of extrapolative mirrors, say, if we look at the work that our field of anthropology is doing in the public life of politics, in the public life of art, in the public life of fiction, beyond the proper domains of our own discipline, we can begin to see the value of the ideas and possibilities and perspectives that anthropology puts into play, because it's precisely those possibilities that certain very interesting artists, activists, and writers have mobilized to do the kind of critical cultural work that they've been doing. So what I'm going to share with you now is a bit about a pair of artists from the Bay Area who have been working in particular with plastic residues and wrestling with the problem of ocean plastic from the standpoint of their own practice as artists. Sausalito, 2004. A peculiar kind of exhibition, something between art, science, fantasy, and activist intervention, is unveiled one November day at the San Francisco Bay Model Visitor Center. Fixed to the wall are long rows of bottle caps and combs, cigarette lighters, and shotgun wads, all made of plastic and strangely pitted and weathered. Nearby is a series of narrow tubes crammed with brightly colored plastic fragments, carefully sealed and mounted vertically with the semblance of geological core samples. These are the remnants of a bygone civilization, the wall text tells us, placing visitors in the distant future year of 2855 CE. Researchers from the future, it seems, have found and excavated a unique and anomalous stratigraphic layer in the Earth's crust, what they call a Pleistocene discontinuity. The findings invite speculation about the people of this age of Greece, as they call it, whose fixation on hydrocarbons and rivers of indestructible plastic waste drove them ultimately to ruin. There is much evidence, the wall text suggests, that they were a warlike people whose children actually played with tiny armed men acting out battles from the continuous warfare of the Pleistocene. The curious array of rectangular boxes were fuel containers used to ignite a very popular drug, which was drawn into the lungs to enter the bloodstream. There's evidence that the use of this drug was a signal that the user was very brave, as the drug was at once highly addictive and caused several debilitating diseases. From this, we imagine these were a very tough-minded people. The installation put up by the Bay Area-based artist couple, Richard Lang and Judith Selby Lang, anticipated by well over a decade arguments now made by earth scientists that the swelling plastic debris of our time, the billions of tons of bottles, brushes, wrappers, and countless other things buried in landfills, littered on coastlines, and settling onto seabeds, is an essential stratigraphic indicator of the Anthropocene. Lang and Lang share their archaeological sensibility with many other contemporary artists who work with plastic detritus, taking these abandoned everyday objects as ciphers for the societies that cast them away so lightly. Works like the Pleistocene discontinuity also playfully evoke broader currents of affinity between anthropology and contemporary art. When I first set out to meet Richard and Judith in early 2016, their house in Forest Knolls, California was unmistakable. It was the one with a giant yellow plastic buoy resting against a tree, overflowing with pale blue ovoid fishing floats like a hoard of eggs from a petrochemical robin. Comic reinventions of plastic trash were everywhere inside, clearly a matter of both art and life. The installation at the Bay Model Visitor Center went up shortly after the couple married at the Burning Man Festival in Nevada. Judith wore a dress of white plastic shards and a shawl stitched together from dry cleaning bags. The pair shared a fascination with things that washed up unpredictably on the seashore, and their most notable collaborative works are arrangements of such detritus, photographed and magnified many times over against a stark white backdrop. Spiff, for example, a print that was traveling with an international art show on plastic when I saw it that year at a gallery in San Jose, California, gathers up a plastic bottle, spoon, and toothbrush, along with a piece of astroturf, part of a toy truck wheel, and other assorted debris. Mind you, this is the picture on the cover, which I am lucky enough to be able to share in this manner. They were gracious enough to allow me to share this very print, Spiff, on the cover of this book. Beautifully enlarged to fill out a frame 3 feet across, the image captures minuscule nicks and hollows in the surface of these objects and a gentle mottling of their synthetic hues, a patina attesting to their lengthy life at sea. I had the chance to visit Kehoe Beach, the beach where the artists have been trekking up and down collecting all of these objects, one August morning in 2016. Plastic is the excrement of oil, Richard intoned, quoting Norman Mailer with mock gravity as we walked along a trail down to the shore. He and Judith showed me how easily one could overlook the countless man-made objects buried underfoot. Working our way up and down the beach over the next couple of hours, collecting sacks in hand, we found bottle caps, knotted bags, clothing tags, and bits of polypropylene rope and netting, also countless tiny and anonymous fragments nestled among the seaweed and pebbles. Judith pointed out many nurdles, industrial raw materials in the shape of tiny plastic pellets, which they had first noticed some years back when staking out 4-foot square plots to excavate the shoreline as carefully as possible. All told that morning, after just a few hours of gathering, we managed to find an astonishing 774 pieces of plastic debris working their way into the depths of the sand. Over their years of collecting, Richard and Judith estimate, Kehoe Beach has given them more than 3 tons of such plastic things. The material goes to a barn below their house, where it is washed and sorted by color and kind. I spent a few hours there one afternoon, examining their collection, most of it stacked in cardboard boxes with labels like blue, pink, shoes, and cutlery. At first, it was overwhelming, sifting through the sheer mass and variation of what they had found. The toy astronauts, guns and robots, the heap of grimy toothbrushes and the lid imprinted with Chinese characters, the piles of broken containers like tinkling plastic potsherds, the lawn sprayer valve and the tag from a long-gone shipment of food. Then I began to notice the consistencies in what was here, the distinctive smell released by a box of tattered balloons, or the way that each piece in a box of burnt and molten plastic rubbish had congealed into a unique approximation of organic form. I thought of what Judith had said of the pull tabs that are ripped out of fresh cartons of milk. Put them together side by side, and a whole world of pull tabness reveals itself, she said. Each piece of plastic contains that revelation. It was this possibility that the Plasticine continuity sought to kindle, the idea of being drawn in unexpectedly by commonplace things. The exhibition recast their ongoing excavations at Kehoe Beach as work by archaeologists from the distant future. Carefully laying out sets of lighters, toothbrushes, plastic balls, and other banal items, side by side among many other objects of their own kind, the work encouraged a lighthearted examination of the creative impulse of Plasticine peoples. There were echoes here of Horace Miner's classic satire of the Nasirema, in their exploration of a fastidious and vain people obsessed with products for personal hygiene. But the anthropological vantage point gave the artists a unique way of engaging such habits in a mood both bemused and generous at the same time. Look closely and you can see the mark of all the little balls the exhibition advised viewers, describing the little translucent florets that would have carried explosive metal pellets for the bygone humans who lived by hunting animals and eating them. Presented in this manner, the heedlessly disposable plastic shotgun shells of our time, cast by the millions into forests and wetlands with the firing of these guns, with well over 1,000 found by the artists on Kehoe Beach alone, became things to approach with a measure of sympathy and not just horror. And that, I'm going to stop reading from this chapter here, but that, in a sense, is the nutshell of the argument around humanity that this particular chapter broaches. The idea that through anthropological encounter, one can enter into the lives and circumstances of others unlike oneself in a spirit of sympathy that makes it possible to create forms of understanding, dialogue, engagement, communication that would otherwise be really difficult in the absence of those methods and those dispositions. And I try to show this throughout this chapter in a variety of different ways. So the final portion of the book is a coda on critique. It's where I try to make the argument that what is at stake in anthropology is not is critique, but critique in a manner that we might, in a sense, be unaccustomed to thinking about or thinking through. That is to say, the argument that I make in this final portion of the book is that what makes anthropology tick, what gives our work the force and import that it has, is what I would like to call an affirmative mode of critique rather than a denunciatory mode of critique. And maybe, in fact, the best company for that argument is this particular image. Critique is an art or practice of prizing open the fixity of what is present and keeping it open, Michel Foucault has argued, a means for a future or a truth that it will not know nor happen to be. In this idea of unknown truths and futures, there's something curious that needs to be unraveled further. Criticism is typically thought of as a matter of denouncing what is wrong or unjust, with the idea in mind of a specific alternative, with a notion already of what is right. Indeed, as Raymond Williams notes in Keywords, the term criticism carries in English the general sense of fault-finding, or at least of negative judgment. To take up critique, however, as a means of tending an open horizon, is to proceed in an affirmative rather than negative manner, to work within the space of what would seem to be given as a problem in the world, and to seek out, even here, as Foucault writes, a field of possibles, of openings, indecisions, reversals, and possible dislocations. Here's a picture of analysis unfolding in collaboration with potentials already in the world, rather than by stepping aside and pointing out what is absent yet ought to be present. It is a practice infused with existential generosity, with care for what is and its promise of becoming otherwise. This vision finds its fullest expression in a celebrated interview that Foucault gave to Le Monde in 1980, an anonymous exchange we know as the masked philosopher. This is a long quote from Foucault. It's one of my favorite passages of Foucault. It's the best. Judgment is being passed everywhere, all the time. Perhaps it's one of the simplest things mankind has been given to do. And you know very well that the last man, when radiation has finally reduced his last enemy to ashes, will sit down behind some rickety table and begin the trial of the individual responsible. I can't help but dream about a kind of criticism that would try not to judge, but to bring an oeuvre, a book, a sentence, an idea to life. It would light fires, watch the grass grow, listen to the wind, and catch the sea foam in the breeze and scatter it. It would multiply not judgments, but signs of existence. It would summon them, drag them from their sleep. Perhaps it would invent them sometimes, all the better, all the better. Criticism that hands down sentences sends me to sleep. I'd like a criticism of scintillating leaps of the imagination. It would not be sovereign or dressed in red. It would bear the lightning of possible storms. These words, perhaps something happens to you like me on reading them. The mind isn't made of soft wax, it's a reactive substance, Foucault says elsewhere in the interview. And there would appear to be a reason, therefore, for the poetic force gathered into this passage. These words seek to broach a fresh surface of contact with the minds of imagined readers, to land in unexpected places and form shapes, Foucault says, that I had never thought of. This is critique as an open-ended process of creative emergence. And it is crucial to observe that this is a process understood to begin with empirical encounters, with the vibrant matter, as Jane Bennett would say, of a living world, fire, grass, wind and foam, books, minds, and all. We in anthropology know this ambition well, we metaphysicians of description. For there is nothing abstract in our critique of humanity. As every ethnography shows, it is by attending to the concrete elements of life, attuning oneself to the critical value of thinking with them, that anthropology opens the horizons of a possible humanity. Like experience, then, the possible has a double life as both object and method in the discipline. Both is something to which to turn and consider, and also the stage of a transformative operation. This is what sustains the field's cosmographic ambition, the aim of reinventing the whole through a shift of perspective, the idea that the world itself can change with the assumption of another point of view. This book is also presented something like a fable, this possible anthropology, one way of imagining what the field has been with an idea to what it might offer now and ahead. If there's anything at all that has motivated this effort, it is the problem that propels so much work in the discipline these days, the question of pragmatic value. For we do need ways of seeing the world anew. And stories like ours can be tailored for times of darkness, for moments of profound and unsettling disquiet, in the face of intractable forms of injustice and neglect, as resources for assurance and imagination when the light begins to fade each evening, as it will. We speak into this darkness, not with the promise of a dawn to come. Who wants to spend all night waiting for that anyway? But instead with the knowledge that the world will feel different when it does. So that's where I end with this particular book, and that is where I will end this particular discourse. Thank you for your patience in listening over the course of nearly an hour. I've done my best to lay out the central stakes of the book, where it came from, how it unfolds, and try to give you a bit of a glimpse of how it's written and how it seeks to do what it tries to do in the manner